Hello. So I'm Kalynne. I am part of GCS Texas, and I'm actually our National Business Development Lead. Wanted to go ahead and address one of the very first questions because it's kind of important as far as the intro goes. One of the questions we got during registration was, during the process of organizing this, did we engage with neurodiverse people? I wanted to go ahead and say absolutely. I am neurodiverse. I have ADHD. And I am dyslexic, as well as we have spoken with not just advocates, but other neurodiverse people as well throughout the process. So I'm going to go ahead and start introducing our panelists. So Jennifer, if you would like to start.
I am Jennifer Farmer. My pronouns are she and her. I come from Texas. I am a Black woman with long locks up in a bun with a blue shirt today. I'm a 15-year educator. I work with students with exceptionalities that range from mild to moderate, with typically your neurodiverse type students. And our post-secondary outcomes have a tendency to be a little bit more depressed than their counterparts. And so I am actively working with students to self-advocate for themselves and working with entities and organizations, trying to get you all to be a little more inclusive to see how we can get our scholars placed in your programs.
Brian, if you'd like to go ahead and chime in.
Yeah, I'm Brian Scott. I'm with Accenture. I have a day job where I'm in sales in the Microsoft Business Group, but I spend a lot of my time leading the Neurodiversity ERG, which I founded about a year ago, and then working with our talent and organization practice to add neurodivergent friendly options to our advisory practice. And like in terms of including neurodivergent people, I'm identified ADHD and dysgraphic as a kid, and then I got the adult bonus autism identification as well.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Danielle.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle. She, her pronouns. I am a white woman with dark hair, and I have green eyes. I live in Austin, Texas, and I'm here representing Dell Technologies. In my day job, I lead our hiring strategy across North America for individuals with disabilities, and within that encompasses our neurodiversity hiring program, which I lead. I also identify as neurodivergent. I was diagnosed with dyslexia and ADHD at a really young age. And let's see, I also sit on our board for our True Ability ERG at Dell, which is our ERG for individuals with disabilities and allies. So yeah, I think that covers it.
Awesome. Thanks, Danielle. And so Betty is actually going to play us a quick intro for Rajesh. He was super excited to participate. Unfortunately, he did have something really important come up, but he did record some great tidbits for us as far as what he does being the CEO of Ultranauts and some of the things they have done to ensure a great process for people in our community.
Hi, I'm Rajesh Anandan, one of the founders at Ultranauts. We're on a mission to demonstrate that neurodiversity can be a competitive advantage for business. And in order to achieve that mission, we're building a world-class data and software quality engineering services firm that can deliver better value for the enterprise clients we work with, and designing a more universal workplace where all brain types can thrive and that can serve as a replicable blueprint for other employers. And so we're 9 years in. We've been growing at 40-50% a year. We work with Fortune 500 clients like Goldman Sachs and Disney and Pepsi. And we've built a truly neurodiverse team that's working all onshore in the US across 30 states. 3/4 of our team is neurodivergent. The majority of our teammates are autistic. We have many teammates who are ADHDers, who are dyslexic. We have teammates who are non-speaking, who are hard of hearing. And we just have a lot of different brain types. And we're showing through our business performance and through the practices we've created and invented for ourselves that bringing together different brain types and different problem-solving styles, different approaches, and forging collaborative teams leads to better performance.
Kalynne, looks like you're on mute.
Thank you. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and just kind of transition into our conversation. So as far as best practices in your hiring process, What are some of the simple actions that your organization can take during the interview process to ensure that it's more inclusive? So Brian, I would actually like to start with you on that.
I did it again. So there's two ways that I think work on a universal level rather than creating just a separate program. The first and both of these work in general kind of inclusion as well, of like identifying that people might be different from you and not really holding against them. So we've switched early on to a computer-based option for our first interview, which isn't best for all brain types, but for people with social communication differences is useful. That's one piece. And the other thing we're looking to do is just create awareness among hiring managers that skill can look differently than you necessarily want it to, right? And there's a lot of ways to create awareness at a general level. And then the other thing we're looking at doing that's a little more specific is looking at ways to treat neurodiversity as another affinity group, right? Where we're very good as a company, extremely good at going to universities and saying, like, here are communities that we want to target. Here are senior executives within our company that identify that way. Let's talk to them, make our company more attractive, and then enable them to do well throughout the interview process, right? We're as a company very, very good at that across a lot of different affinities. And we're starting to look at neurodiversity that way because universities have a good idea of who's neurodivergent on campus. So those are kind of the ways we're looking at getting into the space.
Great. Well, thank you. Danielle or Jennifer, do y'all happen to have anything you'd like to say on that?
Yeah,
I would like to
go for it, Jennifer.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Danielle. Just demystifying the entire process. It's stressful looking for a job. The entire hiring cycle is a little bit stressful. And so if we can just be transparent about it, what is the timetable? How many people will I interview with? Who are those people? And just making it clear throughout the process and what it looks like early on. I think that'll be helpful. I also like making us feel safe enough to disclose very early on in the process, and also not putting the onus on or the labor on the applicant to say, hey, I identify this way, these are my needs. Maybe our applications can ask very early on, maybe, what can we do to facilitate the success for you in this interview process? Go ahead, Danielle, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. The only thing I would add, and this is something that I think any company can do, regardless of the size, whether or not you have an inclusive hiring program specifically for neurodivergent job seekers, something that I would encourage is consider your job applications and really take a closer look at the language that's used on those job applications or the job descriptions, especially when it comes to those like quote unquote requirements that are listed. Because sometimes those requirements aren't always actually a requirement. For example, a lot of the time you'll see something like strong communication skills listed as a requirement. But what does that really mean? Are we expecting someone to give keynote presentations on the daily, or do we just need someone who can effectively respond to emails? Similarly, thinking about different backgrounds, a lot of the time you'll see the requirement of like a 4-year college degree. But we should also recognize that some people get the skills that they need for these types of jobs, for any type of job, in a variety of ways. A lot of people are self-taught. Some people might take a couple years of school or get a certification in different areas. And so maybe thinking differently about what we're actually requiring, because sometimes that can kind of push people out or push them away from actually applying if they're seeing that as a deterrent to getting the job.
And can I piggyback on that, Danielle? I love that. I think that you're absolutely correct. We're having, some of the language in the, it needs to be cleaned up, but also all of the information there isn't necessary, right? And so we're asking about the date span you went to college. So are you judging me that it took me 6 years as opposed to 4 years to finish? Or can we just say, I have the degree and this is when I graduated? And so we want to make sure that, because sometimes we are not intentionally being a little bit biased or asking for information that's not necessarily germane to whether you can do the job or not. If you require the degree, just when did you graduate? And I think that's it.
Yeah, great point.
And I want to yes and a previous point about removing kind of ambiguity from the process. And interviews are a game. They're a game, and there are rules to them, and the questions people ask are not what they really mean, but it's all very predictable, right? Like we have a confirmation interview, and if somebody, like as an autistic person, I used to be terrible at interviews, and I had people take the time, or I've read resources that explain here are the rules of the game. I can shove it in my algorithm. There's an if and then statement, and I can be very, very good at interviews now. So when we talked about like treating it as a different affinity group, we're talking about like interview training for neurodivergence, but that clarity of like, here is the game is good for everyone. I spent a lot of my life living in China, right, where I didn't know the rules of the game for lots of reasons, but I can assume here that there are lots of immigrants that also don't know the rules of the game, or minorities as well. And that's a place where if you solve for people with social communication differences and just make the game that you're playing clear and explain how to win the game, everybody can participate more. And it's not that I think we're unable to perform. It's just that we at least for me and a lot of the people I talk to, we just need like that made very clear of that this is a confirmation interview. Here's what you're actually asking, right? Or like in a strategy case interview, it changed for me when somebody was like, no, you actually have to show somebody your work. Here's how you walk somebody through the answers and teach frameworks and all of that stuff, just like good housekeeping guides of how to interview. Making that publicly available will help everybody out, but especially people that think and communicate differently, right? And if you give those like algorithms available.
Absolutely. That's a great point. I know that, Ultranauts has done something very similar, and we'll address that later with some of the stuff that Rajesh shared with us. I do want to go ahead and address a question. I think, Jennifer, I think this would be great for you to discuss. So an anonymous attendee asked, do we only think of neurodiversity as things that someone is born with, like ADHD or autism, or do you also include items related to PTSD and trauma responses?
So I think this is a good question, because really in the neurodiverse community, it just means brain differences, and there's like a fluid definition. It depends on who you ask, where you ask, and it's not just totally acceptable here or there. And so there are, and when we even say disability, there are temporary disabilities, there's situational disabilities, and then there's, a disorder or disability. And I am from the school of thought the same that does apply to being neurodiverse, that it is something that you can develop and you can self-identify as. Brian, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think realistically, the only way to manage it is to say that like you're neurodivergent if you say you're neurodivergent. Like, I think that's the only way to do it. So like, I don't even want to say my opinion because it really doesn't matter. If you want to identify as neurodivergent, come in, man, whatever. We're not checking diagnoses.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have addressed some of the things that have been asked already. As far as, honing in on that hiring process a little bit, providing a clear entry to, neurodiverse candidates. We're going to hear from Rajesh on this, but as far as I know, we discussed verbiage and job postings. Is there anything else that's an easy tweak that you would recommend a company could make in order to make that process a little easier?
I think also offering remote interview options for folks, it can go a long way. Sometimes just even being in person can cause a lot of anxiety, and that might disrupt your ability to articulate the way that you want to or mean to. And so I find that it can be helpful to be remote, so that I can, a lot of people are in the comfort of their own spaces. They don't need to worry about other sensory input or differences that might impact them. So being able to interview remotely, I think, is also a great option to offer to anyone, not just neurodivergent candidates.
Absolutely, especially if their job is not going to require them to be on premise anyway. It seems a little bit silly to require them to show up in person when it's something that can be done virtually.
Yeah, and then I also think some other two free things that that any organization can do is, one, who are they interviewing with? We can send, if they're coming in person, can you tell them where? Can you send them a picture of the room? Can you send LinkedIn profiles to them early on so they can get familiar with their faces and who they will be interacting with? Or this is a little controversial. Some people don't like it. And I know my teachers don't like it, but giving questions prior to an interview. The teachers, when I say give them the questions prior to the test, let them study, they're like, what? No. And then when I say it to a recruiter, they're like, you're crazy. But, the art of surprise in learning how to deal with that is stressful enough. And so I think we're measuring the wrong things, because if we give questions prior to and you come and you're not adequately prepared, then that may not be a good candidate, right? And so that you're actually measuring something that you want, someone that is able to prepare for a job. And so I think that is something that all people can do in all organizations.
Yeah, I want to double down on that. Like, I script heavily my life, right? I'm in sales, and it works very, very well because I have 30-minute, very intensive conversations. So for interviews, like, either give the questions, which is one thing, or what changed for me was when somebody explained to me that, like, here are your 6 answers, no matter what the question is. Here are your 6 stories. You're going to tell them, and it doesn't matter what the question is. So you can give it that way or give the answers. But the idea that, like, being thoroughly prepared for a conversation isn't anything but incredibly positive for your job performance, I think, isn't true.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I also want to add that, depending on the role, it could be valuable to offer a skill-based interview experience, having someone show you what they can do rather than just only talk about it.
Absolutely. That's actually something that Rajesh acknowledges. So Betty, if you would like to go ahead and loop that in for us.
At Ultranauts, the way we approach recruiting is through the lens of creating a level playing field and objectively spotting the best brains to do the job. We call this approach objective recruiting. We've just looked at the evidence of what works, what are techniques that are good predictors of on-the-job performance, and then taken a leap of faith and left behind those things that don't work but are familiar to many of us, like insisting on including a specific number of years of work experience in a job posting as a requirement. There is close to zero correlation between the number of years of work experience and on-the-job performance. Study after study have shown it. And yet, most of us, including ourselves before we've arrived at the place we are, used to insist on this as a requirement. And you can imagine why this makes no sense. Like, let's say you said 8 years of work experience. Why not 7? Why not 6? And let's say 8 was a magic number. Maybe did the person learn anything while they were there? Did they actually do a good job? And if they did, what were the contributing factors that allowed them to be successful? And are those same factors present in your organization? The answer is no to all of this. You should get rid of it. We don't include it. We've banned it from our job description. The second is that when it comes to screening, we use objective techniques. So unstructured interviews are impossible to yield an objective view. If anyone's using those, you should stop. Study after study have shown that they're very poor predictors. Structured interviews can work, but only if you have a scoring rubric that for each question defines what a good answer is, what the components of an answer that should get a high score, so that you're trying to control for the biases that are very natural in every interview that'll kick in by having an objective standard defined of what is good, so that they can compare the answer they're receiving from a candidate. And then finally, we use job tests for all roles at all levels for all applicants, not just for entry-level roles, or not just for technical roles, or not just for neurodivergent applicants, because the job test is the single best way to observe how someone can do at the job. And we've done this for hiring a VP of sales, for hiring recruiters, and also, of course, hiring the core roles for data quality engineers or quality analysts or managers. And we have a 95% retention rate because we're able to actually spot great talent through the simple approach of using job tests and structured interviews, not excluding people based on a number of years experience or even degrees or certifications, which have nothing to do with someone's ability to do the job. And these are fairly straightforward techniques that are supported by decades of evidence And the only thing left to do for organizations is to just follow the evidence and be willing to let go of those things that felt familiar, felt like we were in control, even though, of course, they don't work.
Okay, I have a couple more questions before we move on. I have an anonymous attendee asking, I recently got an IT support certification from Google Coursera and looking for a remote entry-level job. Any advice to job seekers just starting out as neurodivergent?
Well, I'll go first. I think one of the things that was helpful about being able to do everything online now is reach out on our social platforms. And so LinkedIn is a great platform to reach out to people in those companies that you want to work with. And you just don't cold call them or just reach out to them and say, hey, I need a job, but, engage them online, see if you like what's going on. And then you can engage them and see, what is it like even working at the ideal company? You may not even be a good fit for that job or be someone you really want to work. And so I think LinkedIn is a great platform for you to be able to reach out and talk to people within that industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I think going back to the networking piece, because I do a lot of that, it's important to have an in on LinkedIn rather than just going to the people that you want to go to, right? And I think the upside of being neurodivergent is that you'll find people within the community that want to help, right? And so I think that can be a place where you're searching on LinkedIn for what type of person in this massive company to reach out to. Like the neurodiversity ERG is going to be a good spot. Like I will always respond for that. And a lot of people won't. So there are other ways to that colleges depending on your network and if it matters. But I think the neurodiversity community is tightened enough that you'll be ready to get somebody that is an actual advocate than somebody who's pretending to be and wasting time.
We've touched on it a little bit, but I think my advice to the individual who asked the question would be also to ask for what you need in the interview experience. If you would like questions in advance, it's worth asking. And if the company turns you down, then maybe that tells you something about the company.
Yes, absolutely. That can certainly be a red or a yellow flag if they're not open to working with you on that. So Kenneth is asking, where do we cross a line from playing that game in an effective manner before it turns into masking damages over time?
I guess I talked about the game, so I should probably do this. I don't know, man. It's personal, right? So I'll talk about me. I don't mind having a customer service voice in formal settings, right? That isn't damaging to have a formal speaking style like this. It's damaging when I maintain that persona outside of the confines of a formal meeting. That's for me and what I can do. And I've kind of gotten a special interest in these games. So that's me, but I don't know, man. I assume it's going to be different for every single person. That's me.
Okay, great. So does anybody else have any questions specifically on that portion before we move on to chatting about onboarding and just like retention of existing employees? Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and address a question from Meredith. What is the best way to describe working with ADHD to an employer or a boss without oversharing?
I think when it comes to, I think this touches on disclosure, and sometimes that's not even necessarily needed to still get your needs met. To tell your employer or your new manager how you work best and, in what ways you can be successful in the workplace, I think still gets the point across without actually having to even disclose. That's a personal choice. And so I would start there, figuring out, what works best for you and how you can get your needs met, and then having that conversation. And I'm not sure that would necessarily be oversharing, because it's important for your potential new manager to understand what your needs are so that you can be successful.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think whether or not you say the ADHD word or the dyslexia word or the autism word, it doesn't matter. You're still going to have that entire second part prepared, because you shouldn't assume that your boss knows what it means, and especially what it means to you. So that point of like what that means to you, what the skills are, and the working styles that you want, that's kind of the core of the conversation. And then you can add a pathology on it if you want to share that with the boss, which I do depending on the situation. But yeah, that part that Danielle mentioned is actually the crux of the situation. And that depends on the person. I think one thing we're looking at Accenture for this, just because self-identification is so low, especially for adults, right, of neurodivergent conditions, is we do a lot of work on skills, like identifying skills through like formal programs. And those align really, really well to skill sets for neurodivergency. Like you can look at my skills ratings on Gallup and know, like, you know what you're looking for. It's pretty obvious I'm autistic. And we're also looking at ways to enable employees to use that to describe how they work best, and just things like this, how to describe how they work best, whether or not they're self-identified and whether or not they want to disclose. Because it's like, I'm at a point, and this might go off topic, like whether somebody's subclinical autistic or autistic, to me, doesn't really matter at the company. What really matters is getting them access to what they need to work right. And that's describing what's best and how you work best with a team, and how you like feedback, and how long it takes you to respond to Teams messages and all that stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to what you said as far as comfortability sharing situationally. That's incredibly important when you're deciding how you want to, work your career with what you have going on. I do have, is it Juwan raising their hand? If, let's see. Thank you. Go ahead and ask your question.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have a question that I put in the Q&A. We know structured interviews are a critical aspect of having an unbiased interview process. So can you provide examples of how you would adapt that for those structured interviews for those people that are neurodivergent? Because if you have a set outline of questions, and a person may be neurodivergent, that may need a different interpretation of the questions, how would you go about that process?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a variety of, we kind of touched on some of it, but, offering a skill-based style interview. So in addition to some of those traditional questions that are typically asked, being able to also give examples of work that you've done in the past. So someone can actually sit side by side or, online and see some of the work that you've done is a good way to also communicate in those situations.
Absolutely. Jennifer, did you have any tips on that?
Actually, I don't know that they need to be adapted once we have vetted the questions, because what you want to do is make sure that the language is simplified in a way that it's not confusing, and that it's rated that it's rated in a way. And so I wouldn't further accommodate it. I think the point of the structured interview is to be sure that, one, we are mitigating any bias, but we are asking the same questions of everyone. We have a tendency to, not ask questions based on a feeling we get or based on social competence. And so once we have developed and vetted a certain number of questions, I wouldn't go into accommodating it, because just because we identify as neurodiverse does not mean that we are less than, or that we can't meet the standard of the company. It just means we need a little bit more. And so I think the standardized interview is more for the interviewer to minimize their bias than to look at the competencies of the interviewee.
Absolutely. I think trying to level the playing field rather than giving somebody a leg up is the goal, making sure that everybody is prepared and we can really get the meat of the conversation from the interview, rather than focusing too hard on, it's not giving a leg up, it's making sure that everybody understands what the goal of the conversation is.
Right. Our inclinations are our inclinations, and the way that in our biases are biases, and oftentimes we don't see them or we're not aware of them. And so sticking to that script, those structured interviews, that is your accommodation per se. And it's for them to mitigate and to ensure that they're treating you fairly. And we're not, leaning into any of those implicit biases that we all hold.
Thank you. Phenomenal answers.
Yeah, and I
Thank
think making sure that those interviewers not only have that script and the same structured questions, but that they are prepared with unconscious bias training so that they can catch themselves in those moments when they're, inferring something without actually saying it clearly to a candidate. There's a lot of moments when I think it's important for anyone who's conducting an interview to kind of take a step back before asking a follow-up question and try and figure out whether or not, you're implying any social cues that might not being picked up on by the interviewee or something, so that, providing that unconscious bias training is really important, aside from just the structured interview questions, I think.
I think that's important, Danielle, because I think, in our rush to, we're all excited to make sure that we are doing the right things. We will change one thing and we're like, okay, we're going to do structured interviews, but we forget about the training piece, or we forget about the application piece. And when we're doing one thing, a lot of times we're nullifying the biases that we're trying to overcome, or we're trying to disregard and get out of the process. And so you're right, we want to make sure that we are doing structured interviews, but we're also reconsidering the application, but we're also providing trainings. And so we have to do kind of a wraparound approach to make sure that we're addressing it from all sides.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's one of those situations we don't know what we don't know until it's brought to our attention. So thank you. Okay, so as far as, the process goes, when we've got a great team, what can we do to retain them? What can a business do to ensure that they're fostering the inclusive environment, specifically with neurodivergent people in mind?
So when we start that, I think the onboarding process and the orientation process, we do need to treat them as two separate elements of the process, but also that it's almost like drinking from a fire hose. You're getting so much information, and there's so many demands during that time. We should really make sure that supervisors are involved, but job coaches and mentors are involved as well, because now this is your employee and you want to retain them. And so what does it look like to retain them? And what does it look like to identify very early on a longevity plan, a succession plan, or something to make sure that they can go through the ranks if that is their desire. But having a mentor and a job coach, I think, is really, really important for persons that are neurodiverse, and especially if they're either hybrid or they're off, they're remote. Because how do I stay connected to the job, the organization, and then how do I stay connected to the community there and the people? And so you need to think about all of those things during onboarding.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, the onboarding and the retention part are very different. Brian, did you have anything on that topic to add?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two sides of what needs to happen here. One is there's an HR element of needing to enable people to succeed in a large corporation, if that's where you are. And I spent my life in large corporations that nobody really understands how to get around, right? So there isn't like a guide sitting around for that. So like HR investing in like, this is actually how this company works, and putting it in a single place and explaining it is good for everybody. I think what I'm more interested in right now is there's getting neurodivergent people in the company. Enabling us to thrive is a lot more complex, because there's no other pillar that really affects day-to-day working styles quite as much, right? So like something that I hear in my reviews, in a lot of my friends' reviews, is like, Brian's great, he does things nobody else can do, top right corner, 20% of the company hates him, right? And like, that's a very common sentiment. And so one thing we're looking at is how to have performance achievement reviews that are focused on the presence of strengths and skills rather than the absence of weaknesses, which is really different. And the other thing we're doing is like really looking at ways of teaming that work well. And Rajesh does this really well at Ultranauts, which is looking at Agile and saying like, well, how can we take this methodology on a day-to-day basis and help people work together better that might think differently? And I think one thing that Rajesh found with Agile, which I think we're looking at from design thinking to whole lots of methodologies across the innovation spectrum, is that these methodologies are pretty clearly created by neurodivergents as ways to manage their work. I would bet my life on it. And my working theory is that then MBAs come on top of that and add a whole bunch of other stuff, and it's miserable. And so what we're trying to do is come up with processes on a day-to-day basis that enable people to thrive, right? And so like Rajesh does this really well, and often it's his thing, but like looking at this concept of agile delivery, that there's a 2-week sprint where every 2 weeks you're going to a whole other thing. That's not part of the original Agile manifesto. An MBA came up with that. And actually the way we work is like, we will give you 4 days of the best work known to man. And that's gonna occur when it occurs. And on a monthly basis, it's gonna be 30% more work than everybody else. But if you want us to deliver 2 weeks by 2 weeks, like it might not work that way. And so to me, that's what retention really looks like, is getting into the nitty gritty. Autism, so process oriented, but like nitty gritty of how you're delivering things, how you're interviewing, and it's incredibly difficult, right? And that's where most people live, is like this world of overworking themselves for short periods of time, then needing to force themselves to maintain like an overall standard, and then getting into performance review sessions where like they're getting hit for like one conversation that was a little weird, rather than delivering like overall results. And all of that teaming is what we're focusing on. And we're going with this hypothesis that by solving teaming frameworks for neurodivergency, you're increasing access to psychological safety for everybody, right? Because I think everybody kind of knows this, and Dell talks about this, that if you create a system where everybody is saying, here's how I like my information delivered, here's how long it's going to take me to refer to teams, here's how I like my feedback, and you have managers on the lookout for everybody's going to think a little bit differently, that's actually great for everyone. And that's, so when we look at like retention, that's the move we're trying to get, which is long and arduous and involves change management. But our thought process, if we start with the innovation part of our business, where our people are, then we can spread it out from there. But to me, like, self-interested, I can act like a human being for 45 minutes and get a job. That's not a problem. Like acting like a human being for 2 years and thriving and not being miserable, like, and I shouldn't be so facetious about saying act like a human being, but I can, anyway, I can keep my customer service voice on for 45 minutes, not 2 years. That's much more interesting. And I think the place where there's a lot of room for growth, not just in terms of retention, but the value for shareholders is very strong. Like, because the message I'm doing within Accenture is that we're not just leaving people, we're not just making the mistake of not hiring people that are and disclosing people because they act differently. Once people get in the business, we're forcing people that think one way to adapt to some other way of working for no reason, and we're leaving value on the table for our clients, and then we're leaving it on the table for us. So that's my diatribe, but that's where I'm spending my time, is just this idea of like, how can we use neurodivergence and design for that in a way to create psychological safety for everybody, and then like deliver the change the 21st century requires and all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially, when talking about the challenges with Agile and Scrum methodologies, we are going to link some information about that shared by Rajesh, because I think that's a great topic to hit on and would be very valuable to a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think like to that end, like if you have a HR team or if you have a tech company and you do Agile, the number one thing you can do is call Rajesh and get him to look at inclusive Agile for your team. That's like, to me, that is much more interesting, and that will drive recruitment and all this stuff, because once people hear that you can program in a way that isn't ruining your life from MBA product managers, you will have many more people. So that if I were running a tech team, that's what I would do, is I'd call Rajesh, give him some money, and improve my processes.
Yeah, I know he shared some invaluable information with us on those topics. Just the amount of knowledge he had in that space and the things that we discussed that he was able to do for his team were really inspiring. And that's actually part of what got this conversation furthered. He was one of the first people we talked to, and it was just like, this is so great. And it's so good to know that there are people and resources out there that do this as a passion because they can, not because they have to. Him discussing those was incredibly helpful.
And some company out there is going to solve this. Some major company is going to solve this and add inclusive agile to their entire tech team. Nobody's done it yet, and it's going to be a massive advantage. And whoever does it first is going to get long tail advantages of being the first large company to do that. Because nobody's cracked the nut at a corporate scale what Rajesh is doing, but it's laying there. Somebody can do it.
Yeah, it's just like,
sorry.
Oh no, it's okay. That's exactly what Danielle said earlier. She was like, "This is the goal of what everybody should aim for."
And it's not impossible. It's there. It's there. He has the roadmap. Somebody needs to apply it to 3,000 people instead of 200 people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to.
Although, Brian, I would not. That was well put. The way that you put it all together. Hearing Rajesh talk about it is like light bulbs go off. So I hope that he included that in his recording that you all have.
He did, and we are going to be having a discussion with him on that in a little bit more detail in our leadership series, just like we discussed with you. So we will make sure to alert everybody when that becomes available. I did want to address another question. An anonymous attendee asked, what is the ideal role for a nonverbal or limited vocabulary person on the autism spectrum?
I have a tough time answering these types of questions because I don't think that anyone should be pigeonholed into any type of position, whether you are non-speaking or not. And autistic, I think that you can do any type of job, and there are accommodations that will definitely need to be made. But I don't want to necessarily say that there's like one specific type of role, because ultimately we should be able to effectively accommodate for most jobs. I'm not going to say all of them, but for a lot of jobs, we should be able to accommodate people who are non-speaking. And we see that at Dell. You know, we offer jobs across the company. We are a technology company, so we do have a lot of tech roles, but I think that sometimes there's a stigma that autistic people like do STEM jobs. That's not true. You know, there's all kinds of different interests and experiences and skill sets out there. And so I would say go for whatever role you are interested in, and then figure out in partnership with the company how they can support you through that process if you are non-speaking.
And if you're unsure of what you want to do and what skills you have, a vocational assessment through an agency or your school aide should be able to assist you. And so not only does it look at cognitive abilities, which is just a predictor of anything, but also at your skills and what you are able to do, and then also your desires and your likes to help you kind of decide on what would be the best course of best trajectory for you. And again, being nonverbal, there's plenty of assistive technology out there to assist you with any with that and with any job. And so, like Danielle said, you don't pigeonhole yourself, but just what are your desires? So it's not what we think, it's what do you desire to do? And then what skills do you have, and see how they can align those two things.
Yep, great point.
Absolutely. So I have a question from Kenneth. I'm grateful that my discussions with managers have gone smoothly. They've been very accommodating. However, for every interaction with a manager, I have dozens with peers who are not getting the same training, awareness materials, etc. What have you seen work in your environments that gets peers involved? Brian or Danielle?
Yeah, I think Brian would probably second this because I know he's involved in ERG work, but I think employee resource groups, you definitely see business resource groups or employee resource groups at larger corporations, but I would implore any company to identify a way to create these types of groups, because they're really great communities that can both provide feedback on those types of training resources and awareness from, offering their own experiences. And that's a good way to help other employees understand how to work best with anyone, is just, giving them better awareness to it. And so if managers are going through those types of trainings, then I would think that all employees should go through them. And that's something that I think you can partner with ERGs on to really evangelize across the company. And if you have a culture, diversity, and inclusion team, I think that's a great place to start, understanding what types of trainings are already there. And if there aren't enough, then we should be able to partner with employees who can offer insight into their own experiences to share effective ways to work with them.
Absolutely. And I think, previously when I was looking for some sort of support within a company, they didn't always advertise what their ERGs were to the employees. So I would definitely recommend go to your HR team and ask, because if they don't have one that may shine a light on something they didn't realize they were missing out on. Mm-hmm. So I would definitely ask. I think that's a great question. Thank you, Danielle.
Yeah, and I think additionally to that, sorry, I had to drop video. I think the good thing about neurodiversity right now is every company has leadership that needs to do something for diversity and inclusion, right? And they're grasping for something new. And neurodiversity is a new shiny object that they can say, like, look what I did for my team. So, like, even if you're on a team and you don't want to be like Mr. ADHD or Mrs. Autism, which, like, I get, it's tiring. You can ask an ERG to come in and give like a pitch during a team meeting, because at least at most companies I have, there's tons of like IND moments. And that's really where we take advantage of it, where like, even if you don't, like, getting anybody to sit down for an hour-long training is hard, even if they want to. So that's one piece of it. And the other thing is, like, the relationship with parents in companies can be complex, right? Where I think a lot of neurodiversity ERGs started as like a parent support group, and that can be complex, but parents are fantastic allies. A lot of the times they're unidentified neurodivergents themselves, right? Like, programmers are twice as likely to have autistic children as the rest of the population, and like, it's highly heritable. So those are also allies that will be very helpful. So what I found a lot of, like, more often than not, I would say at my company, when I approach a manager, I'm like, let's do an IND moment, like 5 to 10 minutes, just introducing the concept of this. Like, they'll say either I have a neurodivergent child, I'm neurodivergent, or like some other piece. Like the kids are well identified.
Absolutely. Thank you. I do want to go ahead and Betty, if you would like to loop in what Rajesh had to say on this subject, as far as like some of the best practices and inclusive, I get best practices that he was involving to ensure like an inclusive environment.
Ultranauts is an incredibly diverse organization. It's not just that we're neurodiverse, where 3/4 of our team is neurodivergent. We're just diverse. So we have more females than males, including on the leadership team. 1/5 of our managers are Black, a higher proportion than at the entry level. 1/3 of our teammates identify as LGBTQ+. 40% of our teammates were receiving government assistance before joining the firm. 3/4 of our team were long-term unemployed before joining the firm. 1/5 of our top performers don't have a college degree. And so however you look at the group of humans we have together, we're just a bunch of different people. And so for us, we needed to move beyond the traditional DEI playbook of having targeted hiring initiatives or one-off workplace accommodations or providing job coaches for individuals who were trying to navigate a workplace. We had to start from first principles and just reimagine and redesign every aspect of the workplace. And over the last 9 years, we've had the luxury of time to experiment and iterate and fail and learn and arrive at a place where we think we've developed a set of management practices and workplace tools and norms that allow humans, no matter who they are, to use their unique strengths, collaborate with colleagues who are different, and drive value for our organization together. And so a couple of the management principles that we've developed that we hold dear are things like treating mental health as a business imperative, not just lip service, not just an afterthought, but a core business imperative. So what does that mean? Well, first we measure it. So in our management dashboard, we actually have measures of things like loneliness at work. In fact, we've been measuring loneliness on our team for several years. And it's interesting because even though we are all so different, and also we are a remote native company, we have teammates in 30 states, everybody works from home, it's been that way for 9 years. We are not lonely relative to other organizations. So on any given week, maybe 10-15% of Ultranauts report feeling lonely at work, compared to over 40% of the typical American workplace. And so being different and being remote has nothing to do with being connected and engaged and feeling a sense of belonging and being part of a team, which is, of course, important to be productive and drive value. We measure psychological safety. Once a year, we have a third-party independent audit of psychological safety in the organization, in the same way that once a year we have an independent audit of our financial health, because both the psychological safety of our team and the financial health of our operations are leading indicators of the health of the business. These reports go straight to our board, and it creates accountability on the management team to hold true to our promise of creating a more inclusive workplace. And we're not perfect. The last audit showed that 90% of Ultranauts reported feeling safer at Ultranauts than at any prior place they've worked at, which on the one hand is great, but actually we're failing 10% of our team, and that's just not good enough, and so we have work to do. So mental health as a business imperative. How do you measure it? How do you hold yourself accountable to it? And then, of course, provide the resources for teams and team members to be able to take care of themselves and to support each other. The second management principle I wanted to share is that we consider inclusion to be a design principle. It's not just a feeling, it's not just an idea, it's not a letter in the middle of an initialism, it's a design principle. And so what that means is, for example, when we think about inclusion in recruiting, we apply the universal design principles to our recruiting process. And I discussed some of the objective techniques we use, but also in terms of the experience itself. So every interaction, when there's an interview, is multimodal. There's video, chat, transcription, and audio. And you don't need to ask. You are presented with the choice. And that's true of all interactions throughout the organization, even after you join. You don't need to ask, because if you need to ask for an accommodation, that presents a barrier, and some candidates or teammates may not feel safe or comfortable to actually ask for what they need. And so designing inclusive practices as the default makes that problem go away. Another way in which we've designed inclusion into our core practices is what we call inclusive agile. We are an engineering group. We run all of our project teams using Agile and Scrum. And Agile, for many organizations, isn't working out well. There's inconsistent delivery that's the result of pressure and interrupt-driven work schedules and meaningless targets. And it's creating high levels of burnout, low participation, and of course, that affects performance. And then for some teammates, it can be really harmful. And so in our case, those some teammates are most teammates. And so we can't just ignore the harm or treat it as an inconvenience. We had to make it better. And so organically, our team started experimenting with the core principles and ceremonies of Agile and Scrum, and arrived at a fairly structured methodology of how do you implement Agile in an inclusive way. We published a paper in a peer-reviewed journal about this, and now we're introducing inclusive Agile to other organizations so that they could run their teams in a way that's not harmful, that actually allows every single team member to fully participate and contribute, because that's what drives value.
So on that note, I wanted to make sure everyone knows we do have resources in the comments. Jennifer is also going to be sharing some with us at the end. And I think Brian had a couple of places he mentioned you can get really great, truthful information, because there does seem to be a pretty wide array of things you can find that may not be the best resources So we will make sure that all of that continues to go in the comments and is available afterward as well. And Kenneth has also shared a lot of links. Thank you, Kenneth. We really appreciate that. So we do have Rajesh's full video there because, like I said, he does go into some things about Agile and Scrum methodologies and how they've kind of tweaked things to really work well for their teams. Before we wrap up, let's see. I know we had a couple of additional questions. As far as, you know, accommodations, is there anything aside from just sharing virtual information that that any of you would recommend to make sure that the burden isn't 100% on them to ask for assistance?
Well, I would say a software catalog. I'm guessing. So making sure it's kind of like the curb kit, you know, just, you know, a ramp. We all can use ramps, right? If you're pregnant and you're waddling, you use a ramp. You know, if you're tired, you use a ramp. But if you have a wheelchair, you need a ramp, right? And so just making sure that those accessibility options are open and available to everyone. They shouldn't have to ask. It shouldn't be additional labor. Just, this is the catalog. This is where you go if you need these particular extensions or if you need this particular type of support. I think it's good for employers to have.
Yeah, I want to double down on that, where like a lot of times the accommodations are available, but in order to get them at large companies such as mine, you need to enter and create a ServiceNow ticket, right? Somebody will get back to you. Then you need to set up an appointment where you need to talk to somebody, and then you can get your accommodation. And if you're ADHD and autistic, that is not an accommodation. That is terrible. And I'm out. So one of the things that I'm like trying to get our team to work on, I think other companies might have this challenge, is to say, like, we have 30 things where we will always say yes. Like anything that costs under $200 for us costs less than the process of getting improved. So like, why, and my go-to thing is Grammarly. Like, why do I have to go get a ticket and talk to somebody to get Grammarly? Like, who cares if I'm dyslexic? Who cares? Somebody wants a $15 subscription to improve their grammar, just give it to them. And I think that's where we're at, is trying, that's a lot of my effort, is try to just say, like, here's the catalog of things you will just get, and not have to talk to somebody or create another workflow, because I'm done. If you want me to have another call with somebody and create tickets, I'm out. I'm using that to do something else.
Absolutely. I think that's great. Making sure that everybody knows where they can find those resources and making them very easily accessible, where they don't have to go on a trek of investigating that on their own. Really quick, I do want to say thank you to everyone. Danielle, I know you have a hard stop at 1 o'clock. Thank you so much for participating. Before we start letting everybody go, I want to make sure I don't make you late, but thanks, Danielle. We are also going to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I just was going to say thank you so much. This was a great conversation. Brian and Jennifer, really appreciate everything that you shared. And I love the chat. This whole time I've been having a hard time keeping up with it because there's so much great information in it, but this has been amazing. So thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Yep, send all that.
Yeah. We are going to make sure to keep the comments open, and we highly encourage you to engage, obviously, through LinkedIn with any of our panel. Everybody's been so gracious and willing to help. Also, if you want to have access to more conversations like this, please make sure you check out our diversity and inclusion community on LinkedIn. We will also put a link to that in our comments. But does anybody else have anything quick to add before we wrap up? All right. Well, I think that means we did our job for the day. Well, thank you so much again to Jennifer and Brian as well. I know he couldn't be here, but thanks, Rajesh. Everybody has been so helpful and so enlightening. I know that I have learned a lot as far as how I can advocate for myself in the workplace on this subject. So thanks so much. And we look forward to speaking with you guys again.
Thank you.